Good morning. Well, good afternoon, I should say, because it's now midday. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this HEPI London Met event on university and community relations in the pandemic. I'm just going to wait 30 seconds or so before we kick off properly, because I can see the number of participants racking up, and they're going up very fast. So when we get to the sort of number we expect, I'll kick off formally. Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for logging in. This is the HEPI London Met event on how can universities support their local communities during coronavirus. And so we're really going to be talking in the space of what used to be called town-gown relations. I'm Nick Hillman. I'm director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute. Couple of quick housekeeping rules. Everything today is on the record. It's being recorded, and the recording will be available to people who couldn't make today's session, or indeed who want to listen back to it. So everything is on the record. In a moment, we're going to hear some introductory remarks from our speakers. We have asked them all to keep their remarks to 5 minutes, because I'm very keen that this is an interactive event, as our London Met. And that we hear the concerns, the questions, the views of attendees. And we've already had quite a lot of questions submitted in advance, which I'd like to get through as well. So with no further ado, let me introduce our panel. First, we will hear from Lynn Dobbs, who's the co-host of this event as the Vice Chancellor and the CEO of London Metropolitan University. Then we will hear from Janet Burgess, MBE, who's the Labour Mayor of Islington, and a great pleasure to introduce you, Janet, because you're the only panellist I've not met before, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. Then we'll hear from Shakira Martin, who many people listening in will know personally, who was President of the National Union of Students, but is now in the sector working for Rose Bruford College as Head of Student Experience. Great to see you, Shakira. And then we will hear from, just checking my order of speakers. We will hear, sorry, I've got, I'll come back to you, Bob. Sorry, I was meant to mention Bob after Janet. I'll come back to Bob's introduction. Then we'll hear from Justine Greening, the Right Honourable Justine Greening, former Conservative MP and now still, and former Secretary of State for Education, very heavily involved in the social mobility agenda. And our other speaker, who is a recent HEPI author, Lord Kerslake, Bob Kerslake, who has all sorts of roles, including Chair of Sheffield Hallam University, former Head of the Home Civil Service, and as I say, most importantly, a recent HEPI author. And sorry, I've slightly messed up the order there. Bob is going to speak after Janet and before Shakira. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask all the speakers, as I say, to keep to 5 minutes so that we can have a really good interactive panel discussion. So over to you, Lynn.
Hi, welcome everyone. It's really great to be here and to be able to communicate with you about this really important subject. I've been the Vice Chancellor of London Met for just over 2 years now. And in the early days of my tenure in the job, I spent a lot of time talking to staff and students and local organisations about what the value that London Met drives in the city. And it became very obvious that even though my own obsession with civic engagement in universities was clearly evident, that actually it underpinned a lot of what London Met already does. So I haven't come into the institution and changed it to become a civic institution. I think it's always been a civic institution. Or certainly everyone felt that part of their role as a university was not just to educate young people or older people for that matter, because we've got a lot of mature students, but also that we do a huge amount of civic work right across the university. We've called the strand in our new strategy giving back to the city, or giving back to our city. We tend to think of ourselves as working very closely with Islington, Tower Hamlets and Hackney councils, but actually we work closely with a number of other of the boroughs. We've now named that the work that we're doing London Met Lab, And in essence, a lot of that is about working with the local councils, with hospitals, with charities, with schools and colleges. And it's about us really empowering the agenda around social inclusion. We're very much about driving equality and equity and fairness. And actually, so are most of our partners. It's very rare that you come across a public sector or a charity that doesn't have equity and inclusion as part of its remit, but also in terms of corporate responsibility in the private sector. It's a big issue, and it's recognised that in London in particular, there are extensive inequalities and no more so than there are around many of the boroughs that we operate in, that we serve in. During COVID time, we've done a lot of work to support the COVID efforts of many of our partner organisations and communities. So, for example, we had food left in our kitchens, which we got out of our freezer and took to a food bank. We have sewn masks for hospitals before masks were widely available. We've done a lot of the work around vitamin D and its helpfulness, likely helpfulness in relation to countering COVID. So some of it's about COVID, but a lot of it is just about continuing with the rest of our activity, and that's things like skill shortages, money, poverty, child poverty, and I think I'm probably up for the 5 minutes, so maybe I'll just be able to expand on some of that if questions happen. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lynn. So we're going to move from the voice of someone leading an institution to someone who is a key figure in local government in London. So Janet, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Nick, and thanks very much for inviting me. And thanks to Lynn. And of course, I was a mature student at London Met myself, because when I left school, women very rarely went to university, but I caught up later at London Met. So I'd like to give you a bit of background of what happens in the borough. So Islington is often perceived by people who don't live here as a place that is full of streets of multi-million-pound Georgian houses inhabited by rich people. Well, they do exist, of course, but Islington is also a place of stark extremes. It has one of the highest percentages of children living in poverty. It's 10th out of 317 English boroughs, and it's the 5th highest for pensioner poverty. Such poverty has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. And the unemployment claimant count in London has risen by 161% since March, faster than any other region or nation of the UK, to the highest level since records began in 1986. The rise has been even sharper among young people, with the youth claimant count nearly trebling since March. And low-paid Londoners, as ever, are bearing the brunt of the crisis. They are nearly twice as likely to have been furloughed and nearly 4 times as likely to have lost their jobs compared to other Londoners. And low-paid Londoners are nearly 4 times as likely to be struggling to afford both their bills and basics such as food. So what is to be done? Well, clearly one organisation cannot tackle these issues on its own, or if it tried, it would struggle. So the council is really pleased that other organisations in the borough want to work with us. These include Arsenal in the community, the NHS, the voluntary sector, and of course the university. So working with the London Met Lab, we're looking for ambitious and sustained approaches that make best use of the acumen of LMU and build on the strengths of our diverse local communities. We want to close the educational attainment gap for our children and young people. We want to remove barriers to lifelong learning and to reskill residents who have lost their job or are insecure low-paid employment or are long-term unemployed. And we're looking for more ways to combat social isolation, particularly for our growing older population. And another area where collaboration is needed is the climate emergency. We won't achieve our objective on a net zero borough by 2030 without the support of partners like London Met. I know that the university are working towards a joint civic university agreement between the Council, London Met University and City University, concentrating on two important areas, a strategy for racial justice and a skills recovery strategy. And I'm really pleased that both universities already sit on the Council's London Living Wage Action Group. The London Living Wage is of central importance to the Council. It's one of our prime political objectives. And of course, this is Living Wage Week. So I want to highlight as an example of work where everyone's been working together, just one area where many partners and residents have come together during the pandemic. That's around food. It is a sobering fact that many people have struggled to feed themselves and their families for a variety of reasons, but mainly because of lack of money. Coordinated by the Council, food was collected and distributed, firstly from the Sobel, which is a leisure centre run by GLL for the Council, and then from Arsenal's Hub. And both locations are very near the university, of course. So many organisations contributed the food, including the university, as Lynn had said, £14,000 worth of food. Thank you, London Met, for that. It was distributed by many people, including volunteers and mutual aid groups. These groups were organised on a ward basis, and the volunteers did everything from taking the food to people's homes and collecting medicines for people to being a friendly neighbour, which has been so important this year. And so from the Council, London Met, Arsenal in the community, GLL, the voluntary sector, through to people like my neighbours who did my shopping for me in the first lockdown, Islington is a remarkable place with people and organisations which are determined to do their best for the community. It is a good basis on which we can build to go forward and do so much more.
Thank you, Janet, very much. We'll come back to some of those themes, I think. Now I'm going to turn to Bob Kerslake. Bob, one of the things I didn't mention in your introduction was that you're also chair of the Civic University Commission. It's already been referred to. The consensus on Twitter, by the way, is that you look like Jeff Goldblum this morning. So hopefully that will have upped our number of attendees as well. So over to you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much. I'm hoping to get his salary very soon as well, actually. Look, I'll start first with a few words about the Commission report and then see how it connects with what's happened in the last 6 months or so. When we published our report in February 2019, we wanted to really say that the civic role of universities was as important as it ever had been. Universities certainly need their places. We need all the friends we can get in these very turbulent times. But places need universities as well. They are anchor institutions, part and parcel of the well-being of the places they're located in. Now, we found some really great examples of civic initiative, but we found very few examples of a strategic approach to the civic role. And that led us in turn to the proposal to create civic university agreements. Delighted that London Met is one of those doing it, and to the idea of a civic university network. I'm delighted to say that network is now up and running. It's hosted by Sheffield Hallam University, which I chair, and there are now over 50 universities who have signed up to doing a civic university agreement. So what has COVID done? Well, COVID came essentially a year after we published our report. We should not in any circumstances underestimate its impact. It has been devastating for communities, but economically and otherwise. And the key point for me is that it is not a leveler. The effect of COVID has been felt most acutely on the most deprived communities. We have a Peabody index. I chair Peabody as well. And we've found that 40% of our residents have lost jobs or gone on furlough. And of those who've lost jobs, only 13% have managed to get back into the labour market again. 20% of them are in desperate financial circumstances. So for those on low income, this has had a really bad and serious impact. In terms of how it's worked in Sheffield as a university and as a city, then I think it's been a really important learning experience about how we work together. And I would highlight 3 ways in which we have sought to work as a university in Sheffield, with the Sheffield University as well. So first of all, there's been a huge operational task of coordination, 60,000 students coming back to the university at the start of the term. A lot of work went into preparation, but I think everyone would say it's been quite a bumpy ride, with a rapid rise in the number of COVID cases and then an equally rapid fall. Managing the relationships, coordinating what each of the 2 universities were doing and what the City Council was doing was crucial, really, to handling that period. Second area is the fallout in terms of unemployment. I mentioned that earlier, and the need to start to rapidly reskill people into new jobs. The chair of the new Regional Skills Forum in this area is Sir Chris Husbands, the Vice Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University. So we're absolutely locked into the task of reskilling the people who have been most adversely affected by the fallout from COVID. The third thing I would say is that we have to now look, I hope, look beyond COVID to the recovery of our economies, which have been set back very badly. And to contribute to that, we have been key players with the local enterprise partnerships and indeed ourselves in developing how we might build a new economy in the Sheffield City region. We produced an anchor institution submission to the spending review saying how we can grow the advanced economy as the hospital, as Sheffield University and Sheffield Hallam University. What can we learn from this? Well, 3 things for me, really. The speed with which we can adapt to circumstances when we need to, the power of local initiative, really. Maybe if nothing else focuses our government's minds on the need for devolution, this might. And thirdly, the value of collaboration. Those places that had good collaboration, of course, got off to a flying start. But I actually think responding to COVID has strengthened the collaboration between universities and their places and laid the foundation for, I think, a very powerful civic university movement in the future.
Thank you, Bob. Great. Again, I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those issues, and it's great to take the issue away from London, given some of the London focus today as well. So over to you, Shakira. It's fantastic to see you on a HEPI platform again.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks, HEPI and London Met for inviting me to speak here today. I remember it was just over a year ago when HEPI done a breakfast seminar with Robert Zimmer from the University of Chicago, and he was talking about the streams and roles that they do within their local community around civic engagement. And for me, it was not only the end of my coming to the end of my term as NUS president, but for once it was really great that there was a white man in a suit saying what I've been saying for the past 2 years, and it kind of made me think, oh my gosh, what do I say now, kind of thing. So it was really good to kind of have that discussion and to see that this is one of the continuous work HEPI's been doing, and London Met leading the way along with other colleagues in doing that. So for me, when I think about HE's role in civic engagement, I see HE as a vessel that brings to light our society and creates a more just and equal society, because we have to remember universities isn't for everybody and should be optional. And I think that is something to really remember and highlight the different roles education plays in this, and not pitching them off against each other, but in particular with universities. And I see that over the last few years, the demand on universities have changed so much. We're not just education providers, but we're social workers, we're nurses, we're friends, we're doctors, we're mediators. And I think that is really important in understanding the fundamentals of when we are going out into society and doing civic engagement, that these are kind of the values and principles that we have to use, because it's not a one size fits all. And when we're talking about civic engagement, it's not just about talking about, it's about really understanding where it's coming from. Are we doing it because everybody's jumping on it? Or are we doing it to create real impact? because the fact of the matter is we talk about equality and diversity. Sometimes it annoys me quite loosely in our meetings at the tip of our tongues. And for me, I've recognized, especially within my career post-NUS, that we're not all equal. We are all coming from different places, and that's a fact of life, regardless of what position we are. And it's about equity, and to enable to create equity and give people the stepping stones to see over that 5-foot wall. That means we're going to have to prioritize. That means we're going to have to put our money where our mouth is. That means that we're going to have to make difficult decisions and be bold in what we are trying to set forward, and not just put out a fancy statement or policy without having the kind of tangible actions behind it. The issues of civic engagement was way before COVID. COVID has just enhanced the importance of what we need to do in bringing in our society, and in highlighting what communities have done when it hits the fan, that we pull through together, and that there is a love and support and tolerance for different people and working together. But what we have to think about in our strategies in moving forward is that because these issues, access and participation, the lack of, getting diverse people into universities. And when I say diversity, I don't necessarily just mean Black people. That is different. Diversity means that different groups of people with different needs coming from different places. If we're talking about Black Lives Matter, then let's stand firm and say we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and respect that that comes with certain commitments. And it doesn't mean about the oppression Olympics. It's about, at the moment, this is rife in our community. People are talking about it. Life is political, and we need to address this at the moment. So when we're thinking about how we civically engage, and especially now it's different during these COVIDs and a bit difficult doing things digitally, is that we're almost in arrears. The things that we're thinking about is what we should have been thinking about prior to COVID. So now when we're thinking about, digital and using digital as a way to kind of engage with the community, that needs to be an enhancement, not replacing the fundamentals of that, interaction with our communities. So I think that is really important to understand. Lastly, I would say universities need to respond in a meaningful way. So sometimes, you can have the good intention to, bring other people in and have this intention of engaging society and engaging students. But one of the things I've realized during my MA that I've been doing for 7 weeks, and it's totally changed my whole kind of thought process of student engagement. If you lot thought I was the thing before, watch in 2 years' time, I'm going to be fire. Like, honestly, I'm not even lying. But I learned about this acronym of power. And I think this is the last thing I want to leave you with, is when we're talking about partnerships, whether it is with stakeholders, businesses, hospitals, charities, and students, this definition and this framework has really kind of shaped my way of thinking, even as a Black woman, and the power that I hold. And that is around positionality, recognizing and identifying gender, race, class, and how it's considered in low social locations. Yes, London has a certain demographic, but they're not harmonious groups. How do you understand the differences between that? Openness, desire to explore what might be possible, asking questions, and that's about being bold, being innovative, and asking those difficult questions. Because if you want to really engage with society, you've got to get down to the crunch, and sometimes that ain't going to be saying it digestible for us to be able to write in a fancy report. You're going to have to hear it sometimes, like bang, not bang, but you know what I mean. To kind of receive it in a way, and then we articulate it in ways that are digestible for policymakers and government. Willingness to invest time. This is going to take time. You can't ask Black people or disabled people to help you on your strategy in the workplace because they're Black and disabled. Put the time in, invest in that, go and get consultancy of expertise. Just because we're Black and disabled, it don't mean we have the answers. We're not a harmonious group. This word I've been trying to practice forever. Let me just do it on my word thing. Ethnocentricity, that one. Partnering and making assumptions about each other. Again, we're not a harmonious group. We can't just think that, oh, because we're Black and we've got Black people around the table, that's what Black people want, or disabled people want, or LGBT people want. I'm not going to repeat that word again because I can't say it. And lastly, reflexibility. Ability to recognize how we can shape the environment. And again, that's through what we're doing with civic engagement. So that's all I want to do. Recognize the power that we hold within our institutions and individual to have true partnership and to get to the root cause of what we're trying to do, create a just and fair society for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Shakira. That's great. I've written that I've not come across that acronym before, so I've written it down, and we might tweet it out as well. And I think all our speakers today are on Twitter, and there's a Twitter hashtag which is London Met, and then the letter X, and then HEPI, HEPI. So do follow it on there as well. I'm now going to turn to Justine Greening. It's fantastic to have you here, Justine. If I remember correctly, you celebrated your win as the elected Member of Parliament for Putney at Roehampton University the morning after your election, if I remember correctly, which presumably symbolises how important you saw the institution was to your constituency. But over to you.
That's right, Nick. And I mean, it's fantastic to be part of this event. I think probably like other people on this panel, I was the first person in my family to go to university, and it absolutely transformed my life. As Shakira says, it's not the only route for people, but actually for some people it can be utterly transformative, which is why universities have such a key role to play on the broader levelling up agenda. And one of the things that we have been working on through the Social Mobility Pledge is really partnering with universities that are doing innovative things, different things, that are genuine solutions that go beyond almost the more conventional levelling up agenda of universities, which is, of course, their access and participation plan that they have to produce. What we've seen over the last 2-3 years are universities doing really different things that go well beyond that and make a massive difference. We're going to hear, I'm sure, a lot more, hopefully, about what London Met is doing with the London Met Lab. This is totally redefining what universities' relationships with local communities can be. It is about a university that is genuinely taking a local community's priorities through engagement with that local community, but then seeking to build that into the university's priorities too, and actively work on coming up with solutions that are owned not just by the university because they have helped produce them, but are co-owned and co-designed by the community themselves, and then actually also form part of how those students at the university can genuinely learn, and how that can be part of not only a student experience, but actually part of their student learning experience, crucially, as well. It's one of the examples I've seen of how universities are really thinking very differently now about what their place is. As Bob Kerslake has said, this concept of a civic university, I think, is absolutely crucial now. But if you're doing that in a country where levelling up is now recognised as an absolute imperative, Chancellor Janet Burgess talked about net zero. These are the two imperatives for Britain: net zero and levelling up. It's people and planet. And we now need a strategy and solutions on the ground that I think really tackle both of those, and they can genuinely go hand in hand. But universities can be real drivers of those solutions. Other universities we've seen doing some really, really different work are, for example, Bradford, that have been a core part of their Bradford Opportunity Area, and then have really looked at how they work with employers to not only be part of how talent gets developed, but then how they can more robustly connect it up with opportunity. We've seen other universities, for example, like Lincoln, essentially lifting an ecosystem in a more remote rural community like Holbeach, where they haven't just gone and worked upstream in local schools and become one of the sponsors of a local academy. They've also then worked to lift the local economy through their work in Agritech and the National Centre for Food Manufacturing. So not only did they go and drive improving talent, they also then improved, literally upskilled the opportunities that were there for not just young people, but all the people that were in Holbeach community. And in doing so, have brought an entire supply chain into that local area that wasn't there before. You know, you're seeing other universities like the University of Northampton really look at how they procure and what that can do to drive levelling up in their local communities. You're seeing the fact that we can learn from universities, for example, like Aston, which has always had a very natural traditional link with employers, but is now really genuinely asking itself how that works in terms of levelling up and where it targets its opportunities. I'd also point to, there's so many of these examples. I'd also point to Staffordshire University that has done some amazing work, really getting well beyond even perhaps the more traditional polar quintile 1 and 2 and disadvantaged communities, but into some of those, not just places, but people that are massively impacted and far away from levelling up, an opportunity that can be pulled into and allowed to do degrees if they're engaged with properly. So the solutions are out there. That's my message, is that actually we've got the experience of levelling up through universities on the ground. I think the challenge for policymakers is whether they can harvest all of that great practice that's out there and pull it together. And dare I say also start to have it reflected in the league tables, so that the levelling up universities that are out there and really innovating and really making a difference are the ones that are at the top of the list, and the ones that we really understand are actually taking a wider country as well as a wider community's priorities and making it their own. It's a question of how we then build all of this into the formal policy agenda, which is what a government that is committed to levelling up should be looking at doing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Justine. We're going to go first to some of the questions that have been submitted prior to the event. So I'm just going to ask colleagues at Lodestone to line up Susanna Lane, Sarah Gifford and George Kernahan, and we'll see if we can get the tech so that they can ask their own questions. And just while that's happening, Justine, can I just ask you one very quick question, which is, are you mainly relieved that you're no longer in government during COVID, or do you wish you still were, because it's such an important moment for the country?
Well, I made a decision last year that my commitment to social mobility means, for me, that is what I want to put my time into. I felt I could best achieve change on the ground. Shakira talked about impact. I completely agree with her. You know, I didn't want to be in a talking shop. I wanted to be out there on the ground, actively doing change, actively working on grassroots change. So I just love what I'm doing on the social mobility pledge. But Nick, as a Secretary of State for International Development that worked on Ebola, I do know how challenging these pandemics are, and I would have been obviously happy to contribute in any way I could that experience into the COVID-19 response too. But I think what we have been able to do is work with businesses and universities to help them really play their role nationally in helping Britain get through this pandemic. And if we've learnt one thing, what we've learnt is government doesn't have all the answers, and a lot of the answers are out there in a much wider community. If we can get mobilised collectively, then we can make a big difference.
Great, thank you. It's always great, I think, to see a former education minister stay involved in the sector, pushing these important points. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn now to Susanna Lane. It's entirely up to you if you turn your video on or whatever, but hopefully we'll be able to hear you through your microphone for your question, Susanna. So I think you need to unmute. Susanna, can you hear us? Maybe that hasn't worked. Let's I'll try Sarah and we'll come back to Susanna. Sarah, over to you. Sarah Gifford.
Hi, I'm Sarah Gifford. I'm the Community Engagement Officer at Queen Mary University of London, so just up the road from London Met in Tower Hamlets. And my question was around internally within London Met, what challenges have you faced around driving forward the agenda of kind of responding to coronavirus and community needs, and how have you kind of addressed those changes quickly in order to meet those needs?
Great, thank you. We'll put that to Lynn in a second. Thank you, Sarah. Susanna, is your tech working? If not, I'll read out your question. I think Susanna's tech's not working, which may be our responsibility. Susanna's question, and she's at University Scotland, Head of Public Affairs there, is how do universities get beyond or undo the negative impact on community relations caused by COVID outbreaks in student accommodation? So how do we get over the negative impact of that? And then George, the final question in this round, George Kernahan from Ulster University. Over to you.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you. The premise of the session is how can universities do more to help their communities? But it strikes me that this has a two-way component, and in doing this outward-looking work, we also can achieve our own intrinsic academic goals and objectives, particularly whenever you're trying to achieve impact with research or trying to achieve university goals. It seems that it's to be recognised as a two-way street, and I wondered what the panel thought.
Great, thank you. So Lynn, I'll turn to you first, if I may. I think the first question in particular was aimed at you.
Yes, driving forward in the challenges around COVID, we have, when in March, I think we had about 200 partner organisations that we were working with, and we've now got over 600. They come from local authorities, NHS trusts, sports clubs, other higher education institutions and businesses. We were working with something like 30 further education colleges who are now part of our Partners in Education project. So I think I would find it quite hard to think of the challenges, because actually we've expanded our range of activities and the initiatives that we're working on extensively during lockdown. So I wouldn't say so much that there are challenges, except for the obvious difficulty of not being able to call into the offices and meet the chief executive and having to do everything on Teams. But it's not really, I wouldn't say that any of it's hindered our engagement with the process. And we're working with, we've defined our the topics, our main topics that we're working on. We're looking at crime, discrimination, the environment, health improvement, poverty and deprivation, and social wealth. And if anything, it's just made us stronger and more determined.
Thanks, Lynn. Janet, I don't know if you want to respond to any of the points that were made. There was the point about it being a two-way street, and also Susanna's point about how do we get over the negativity that's been caused by the outbreaks in student halls, and you must have lots of students living in Islington.
Yes, indeed. And of course, we've got 2 universities in Islington, so never do things by halves. We've got double most towns. I haven't actually heard anybody talk negatively about students bringing COVID here, because of course London Met mostly gets its students from within Islington and within a various quite a small radius around as well. So I guess, like, unlike the big university towns, we haven't had an influx of students, and I certainly haven't noticed it on the streets. The other point about this being a two-way stream, yes, absolutely. And I did refer to a couple of areas where the university is working closely on specific projects, and I think that is what we will do more going forward. Before I became mayor, I was for 10 years responsible for health and adult social care at the council. And I was talking to people at the university of helping us with research into evaluation as well. And at the council, it's always, you know, not day to day, not always just day to day, but a lot of it is responding to need and crises and having to make sure that people are being looked after. And sometimes we put policies into place and actions into place, and we don't have time to step back and evaluate them. And so I was talking to the university about the possibility of doing that. And I think in that kind of area, there can be a two-way street as well.
Thank you, Janet. That's a lovely segue actually into you, Bob, I think, because what I found one of the most interesting bits of your Civic University Commission report, the links to the research budgets. You saw Civic, the Civic agenda, and I think this plays to the question about it being a two-way street. as being something that has consequences for research spending, as well as the sort of all the other things universities do. Oh, but you're on mute, Bob.
I do think there's a big connection there on research, actually. And two reasons for it, really. One is that all research projects now need to demonstrate impact. And part of the way I think they can demonstrate impact is to be closely involved with the local communities in their area. So I chair two groups now working on this, one that's about housing, the other one which is about tackling different life expectancy amongst different communities. And in both cases, the connection to the local place is vital to the work they're doing. And I think it's perfectly possible for the Civic University agreements to identify areas where further research can be done. So I think there's an intimate link there. It's not necessarily as immediate as the issues we've just talked about the surging unemployment and tackling that. But ultimately, for places like Sheffield to survive in the future, it needs to have an advanced economy, and that has to have a strong basis in research and advanced technology. So I think there is an intimate relationship here, and I think it's absolutely getting stronger, and it's not inconsistent with the global role of universities. Just one quick word on the point about students. Sheffield is a university town. We've got two universities in Sheffield, and like all the other major cities, we saw a surge when the students returned and then a decline, as I mentioned. Actually, I've been incredibly heartened in a way about how little reaction there has been in the city to that issue, particularly given all the debate about tier 3 and so on. And I think a key reason for it was the strength of the relationships and the nature of the communication that went out relentlessly explaining what was happening. That was absolutely central. And it's a good example of the mutual interdependency between council, universities and the health service.
Thank you, Bob. Before I turn to Shakira and Justine, I'm going to go back and get a few more comments from other people listening in, but it doesn't mean you can't respond to the comments that have already been said as well. I'll turn to Shakira and Justine first after the next three people who are listening in. So can we turn to Chris Parr, who is a specialist journalist in education. Many people listening in will know him. And then we'll come to two of the questions that have been left in the chat from Caroline Wilson and Ian McLaughlin. Sorry if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. So Chris, over to you. I think this may be particularly aimed at Justine, but we'll see.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, you caught me on the hook, slightly off guard there. I think this is the question I submitted ahead of the session, which was, does the panel think that the government will ever place as much value and an importance on the civic role and the untangible things that universities do as governments tend to place on things like graduate salaries and more measurable outcomes?
Thanks very much, Chris. And now we'll go to Caroline Wilson. Caroline. The tech doesn't work. Give her, Caroline, I can see you on my screen. Fantastic. Hi.
Hi there. I would like to ask a question about what is it that I work for Islington Borough Council, and I think it's fantastic, this seminar, but I was wondering, what would the panel reflect on? What would make it easier for universities to contribute to a local place? Is there something, or are there lots of things that local government could do that would make it easier for them to engage with us in a very proactive way to contribute to local places?
Thanks, Caroline. Nice constructive question there, which we'll put to Janet and others in a moment. And then thirdly, Ian. Ian, over to you. Ian, I think you're on mute at the moment. And do start by telling us where you're from. Tech might have let us down again. So Ian's question, which is in the Q&A, so people may be able to read it for themselves, is ideally, London Met will help support a green economic recovery by offering courses that prepare its students for green jobs, will London Met be adjusting its course offer to this end? So really a question about climate change and the importance of the green economy. Justine, can I come to you first to pick whichever of the questions we've had you'd like to answer? I think Chris Parr's one was particularly perhaps aimed at you. Do politicians think too much about graduate job outcomes, not enough about the other things universities do?
I think they do, and I think in relation to graduate earnings, there's a lack of understanding in government, particularly in Treasury, that those earnings are also a reflector of how open sectors are relatively to a diverse group of graduates coming out of universities. Plus, of course, a number of the sectors that universities help us fill are public sector roles like teachers, medics, healthcare professionals, who are hugely valuable to a wider community, but perhaps not paid the megabucks that some graduates might earn once they head off into the city. So I think graduate earnings has always been an excessively blunt tool that often ministers will look at to the exclusion of everything else wrongly. I think if you are a government that truly believes that talent spread evenly, opportunity is not, then actually you need to have a refreshed look at what universities are delivering in relation to that. Clearly, they are pivotal in helping talent get developed in right the way across our country. They are social mobility powerhouses, many of them. I think this issue of place has become hugely important for many universities. But of course, perhaps most of all, for some of those universities that are more regional players and are often the ones that are enabling young people to get a degree that otherwise would have little chance. For example, whether they're mature students or commuter students, a whole range of other people going to university now that maybe weren't 10, 20 years ago. But if you want to bring alive the levelling up agenda, then you have to ensure that universities are delivering on that as well. I think the final point I'd make to Chris really is, if you really want to understand what universities are contributing to the levelling up agenda, then you have to look at what they are able to achieve at the other end of the pipeline as graduates leave, not just at the beginning of the pipeline in bringing a wide group of students into universities. As I said at the beginning of this, I think the analysis of what universities are delivering in terms of graduates leaving is too narrow. I think looking at earnings doesn't really give you anything close to the entire picture. I think government should be looking increasingly at the strategic relationships that universities are building with employers, the extent to which they are helping to co-design courses, the extent to which employers and universities are looking at employability, as you say, Chris, these wider benefits, and of course the extent to which universities as anchor institutions locally are genuinely helping to regenerate communities more broadly. There's a much wider agenda there than just graduate earnings, and I think that's the real prize, in a sense, for policymakers to understand that and then build it into the policy agenda.
Thanks, Justine. I think that's a nice full answer that I think a lot of people will agree with. Shakira, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to try and just sum up all the questions in one. I think around the negative impact on the community around students in halls, I think firstly, we need to remember that these students are people, just like me and you. And I think that there's a certain kind of responsibility that the university needs to take in engaging with the community around, we needed these students to get here. It's obviously safer if people stayed at home, but we can't afford our sector to go down and these students to miss their opportunity. So it's about recognizing that, students are coming, they are feeling, some of them feeling suffocated in their halls and a bit, not what they expected. So there is going to at times be conflict or friction. And it's about just recognizing that everybody's kind of in this together and there is no right way. We're learning as we go along, and we're in these emergency COVID meetings almost every day. And by the next day we wake up, we're going to have an agile approach. So for me, it's about being honest and acknowledging the times when you might have messed up and could do things differently, but supporting the students, because at the end of the day, as Justine said at the beginning, is that education, higher education is transformative. It saves lives. But if it's delivered and received in the wrong way, it can have detrimental impact on people's lives moving forward when we're talking about civic engagement. In terms of the two-way knowledge exchange, 100% I agree. But again, we have to recognise our position and the power framework that I said in actually, like, someone's going to have to give. Why are we going to expect the community that's got so much going on, poverty, deprivation, sickness, all of this going on prior to COVID, but including COVID, and expect them to have it in their head to be the first priority to approach the university or to even ask for things that even may be possible? So my thing would be around, and I used to say it in NUS as one of my campaigns, to show that I believe in what I say, is listening, learn, and lead. You need to go down to the ground. You need to really understand and be able to have evidence-based, based on research, but what these different groups are going through. You need to be able to learn from that, learn from mistakes, learn from other people, exchange that knowledge, and then go on to lead. You can't lead from the back and blindsided without doing that. But as in the power framework, you're going to have to the person who's, got more to be able to give needs to step forward and take that. That is what I call civic engagement, and goes back to that vessel. In terms of Chris's bit, I'm not a minister or anything, but I'm going to answer this question, is around, this is a great opportunity for us to think about how education can be delivered differently, whether it's pedagogical approaches or quality or different ways of how it can be done differently. Because we knew prior to COVID that the funding constraints drives the behaviours of our universities. So of course we want more diversity in our institutions, but the funding constraints doesn't drive the behaviours to encourage, to see the greatness in a Bangladeshi woman, for example, coming to university, learning for the 2 years and going home and growing up her children. That is absolutely fine. The funding constraints don't allow that scope to be able to see that adversity and see that as value. And then lastly, I think around what will make it easier for government and stuff. I think, again, be bold, and this is an opportunity to do things differently, and other things will feed in. One thing that COVID has taught me, and I think taught the sector and society, is that we never have time to just stop and pause. Like, it is out, being in education, you're working 24/7, like everything comes out 24/7. But COVID has forced us to have to stop. And now that we're trying to get things back on track, we're starting to panic again and start again. I would say take time to reflect. Sometimes silence, although I'm not really good at it, if you can tell, you can still reflect and hear things during silence. Keeping business as usual and doing the fundamental, but not rushing to do things ad hocly. And while doing that and being able to pause, reflect, listen, learn, and lead, the other things around green jobs, the digital era will come into place, because you'll be able to go back to base, reflect, and be able to put a really sustainable and tangible strategy together that is going to create impact, rather than this lardy-dardy talking. Because I don't want my children here in 10 years' time talking about the same things that I'm doing. That's not impact for me. So, yeah.
Thank you, Shakira. Now, I'm very sorry to say we only have 7 minutes left, and I know Justine may have to go a little bit before the end as well. So if you do have to do that, Justine, thank you so much for your contribution. Before, I know I haven't come to Janet or Bob in this round, or Lynn, but I want to come back to everybody. I want to get 3 more of the participants watching us in, and then go back to everybody for your final set of remarks to say anything you'd like to say, because there are some interesting comments coming in. And I'd like to start with John Baker, if we can go to John Baker, who's got a question around duty of care to students. John, do tell us where you're from as well.
Good morning, Nick. It's John Baker here from London South Bank University. My question was really directed at something Shakira said about universities being so much more than education providers, about being social workers and other things. And I just wondered where, from a sort of jack of all trades, master of none perspective, is there a line to be drawn where universities should be developing insight to shape policy, but not actually responsible for delivery? And is there a sort of temporary shift in terms of the COVID era that we should then sort of rebalance later?
Thank you, John. And now, in a moment, I'm going to come to William Whyte's question. So we might line up William. And I'm also, just while we're doing that, going to read out a question from someone who I think is not actually watching live, but who submitted a question in advance, who is Robin Minocha McKenney, who's Councillor at Large at Mount Allison Students' Union, who asks, in what ways can student groups and organisations promote and or provide support to their communities these times. So specifically a question about the role of students. And I'm going to turn to William, which I'm afraid will be our final question. Sorry if you've asked a question which we've not been able to get to. William, over to you.
You may about to see a picture of a penguin, which my elder son put on here and I've been unable to remove, but it's very nice. It's a very nice penguin. No, the question I was going to ask was just about what the process of emerging out of the current crisis is going to be. Many universities will be seen to have done quite well because student numbers have held up, because you know, some of them are doing economically quite well, particularly when compared to local businesses and other groups. And the claim that universities will have on the public purse will seem to me to likely to diminish as we emerge out of lockdown. And so I wonder how can universities respond to that potential vulnerability?
Thank you, William. Very topical with the spending review around the corner. I'm going to go straight to Justine just to see if she's got any final comments, because I know she has to log off just before 1 o'clock. And then I'll come to Bob and Janet next. Justine.
Thank you. I was just typing an answer to Hayley, who was asking me actually about the Russell Group engagement. I think from my perspective, what this discussion shows is just how absolutely relevant the role of universities is in local communities now, particularly given COVID, and particularly the challenges around upskilling and reskilling and education that come out of it. And I think they have a unique capacity really to not only convene a broad range of different actors locally, whether it's the local authority, the local NHS or other groups, but also then to help them get more mobilized. And I think the more that universities can step into that role, I think the more they will demonstrate their broader role within society. And I think from my perspective, the days of the ivory tower are well and truly over.
Thank you, Justine, and thanks again for being here this morning, this afternoon, I should say. Bob, over to you. You're on mute there, Bob.
Apologies, came a little bit slow, the instruction. Apologies. Just to quickly say, nice to hear from William. I'll be very quick because I know time is running out. Look, I think universities have not fared as badly as they might have done, although the huge change that they had to make to respond to COVID was a big challenge for them, I have to say. And of course, international students has been significantly affected. What's their role going forward? Well, they've got to be part of the economic recovery of places and got to be focused on those who've been hardest hit by COVID. They've got to be seen to be part of that agenda, looking after those who've been most badly impacted. If they aren't, I think people will say they focused on their own issues and not on their community, and that won't sit well. So it should redouble their efforts to be genuinely civic, in my view, but with an added emphasis of the urgency of helping with the task of economic recovery.
Thank you, Bob. Over to you. Is there what else? This is your final chance to say anything.
Final chance. So, Wicked, like the boundaries, I think that was an excellent question that you said. So I don't necessarily mean, what I mean is when we're talking about social workers and nursing and stuff, it's the soft skills that we need of empathy, understanding, being able to critically think, but think outside the box. We're not necessarily qualified to do that, but where the boundary comes in, I think around funding, who's going to pay for it? I think it's easy to provide the service and provide support in these areas, but at the end of the day, at 5 o'clock, we're going to need provisions or something to support, to signpost them onto. And I think it's money for me is that boundary. Our sector is so diverse. We come with so many skills and soft skills and adversity, but we need the funding in place and a commitment in place, whether that is from institution, which I know is very difficult, local government or central government, but definitely we need to ring fence some funding. And in terms of student groups, what you can do is you are the closest to the ground. So use what you know. Your students are from the local community, or take part in church activities, youth, like different voluntary works. They have the knowledge and they have the expertise, and your students' union is again that vessel of how you can create a more localized change within your area. So thank you.
Thank you, Shakira. Janet, over to you. Your final chance to get off your chest anything you feel hasn't already been said.
Thank you. No, I've enjoyed the debate, and I'd like to agree with a lot of what Shakira was saying about the fact that we mustn't compartmentalize students. They are part of our community. They are our neighbours. They're the people we meet down the street and in the shops and so forth. And I would encourage students also to take part in the local community. There's lots and lots of opportunities for volunteering. Particularly in Islington, we have a huge voluntary sector, and they're always looking for help in the short term as well as the long term. So please, all of you from all universities, encourage your students to go out and join in the life of the local area. I think it's also a great link between the community and universities. Yeah, that's probably the best thing I can end on, saying get out there, let's all work.
That's a win-win, because of course it can work very well for students in terms of their employability skills and their softer skills.
Yes, indeed. It always looks good on the CV if that's the way you want to look at it, but they're really useful as well.
It ticks every box, yeah. So Lynn, over to you. I know there's so many things we could have delved even more deeply into than we have, but as London Met Vice Chancellor and co-host of today, what's the most important thing to say for the final word?
Well, just how critical this agenda is. And I would like to just pick up on what's been mentioned there, is that part of our work is to make sure that our students are fully engaged in this, and actually to send them back out into the world as ethical and social citizens, to improve their communities. And if we can achieve that, we've achieved our goals.
Thank you, Lynn. That's a very positive note on which to end, which is always good. And I think the thing that I've had reinforced for me this afternoon is just how rich this agenda is. And although there's lots of very important work coming out of the Civic University Commission, I think there's plenty for all of us to say about it. And I would encourage people who've been engaging with the conversation online this afternoon, if they've got more to say, to get in contact with London Met and the new lab, to get in contact with us at HEPI, because this is clearly an area where we should be doing more work as well. And I hope we can continue this conversation offline. I'm so pleased that we've been able to bring together government, local government, universities, policymakers, student voice together this afternoon. But I know there's a lot more that could be said. And I just want to end by thanking all of you for listening in. Do give us feedback, do propose tributaries from this wider discussion that we might want to delve more deeply into. I'd like to thank obviously Lynn and her colleagues at London Met for letting us work with you on this event, and also Izzy and Harry and others at Lodestone who've done some of the back office techie stuff to make sure it all came together this afternoon. So as I say, do get in touch with us. Thank you very much for attending. And I know none of these issues are going to go away. And in fact, I think what we've heard this morning is a lot of them are even more important in COVID times than they were before. And finally, of course, thank you to all our speakers for giving up their time and for covering so much ground. Thank you very much.